Welcome to another series, another panel in the series of the Summer of Open Data. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and we are delighted to host the Summer of Open Data together with our partners, the Open Data Institute, the Open Data Charter, Data GovHub, as well as BrightHive. And the Summer of Open Data tries to really understand what's the current transition in the field of open data, which we call the third wave of open data, by which we specifically focus on 4 important trends that are really announcing a new wave around open data, around the reuse of data. The first aspect that we are interested in is really how is open data progressing at the subnational level, in addition to the national level. The second area that we are interested in to explore in this series is also how is private data being reused in order to generate insight that can serve the public interest. And then the third area is really around data governance and to what extent can we do advances and can we advance open data at the subnational, national, but also at the private sector level in a way that is responsible. And then lastly, we're also looking into how can we make open data more demand-driven by exploring the concept of publish with purpose. And so that's also what we're going to explore during this panel. And we have the creme de la creme of the open data community joining us today. And I won't introduce them. I will ask each of the current panelists to introduce briefly themselves and indicate what their connection is with the open data, but more importantly, perhaps what their connection is with the emerging third wave of open data. And starting with Barbara. Barbara, can you introduce yourself and specifically how, of course, your work relates to some of the issues that we hope to address today?
Yeah, hi, Stefan and hi, everyone, and thank you for having invited me to join this panel today. I represent the OECD, where I am the person responsible for the work on digital government, open data, and data-driven public sector, and currently also the acting head of division of the Open and Innovative Government Division. And why is this important? Because my responsibility is very much linked to helping governments to strengthen the use of open data, so not just the release of open data, but the use to foster not only the creation of value, but also the fostering of governments that are more open and innovative. So I'm very passionate about this because I've been working with governments on this area for over 10 years now. And it's extremely challenging the moment we're living right now, but also offering opportunities to move ahead with the open data agenda. So happy to join the panel today.
Great, thanks, Barbara. And thanks for joining from Paris, where it's obviously a different time zone than the one that we've started here. Let's go to Jean-Noé.
Hi, and thank you, Stefan, for the introduction and the invitation to participate today. It's great to play a role in this. I think the open data conversation needs to kind of take into account these different waves that you've talked about. So it's good to have a perspective of how far we've come from, but also looking ahead. So I'm the executive director of Open North. We're Canada's leading not-for-profit organization based in Montreal, specialized in open data, but then also over time, reflecting of the evolution of the open data community, developing an applied research lab, as well as a framework on open smart cities to be able to really kind of tailor a range of different service offerings at no fee to communities of all sizes across the country to really kind of scale and really kind of connect them around this kind of data agenda. At Open North, we contribute actively to a range of different initiatives where we're now called upon to talk about ethical data, talk about ethical AI, so really kind of the evolution of data. And also continually working with governments and a range of different sectors, including the private sector, and increasingly over time and currently with first responders and health institutions, and really kind of bringing the openness lens to releasing data of high value for different types of user communities. So glad to be here.
Great, thanks so much, Jean-Noé. And Arturo.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, and hello to my fellow panelists. I am the Vice President for Data and Insights at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is MasterCard's social impact hub within the company. I'm an economist by training and a data geek by choice. Very happy to be here to share some of our experiences in trying not just to do more with our data assets and our talent with the company, but also trying to build the field of data science for social impact, which we have started to do with the Rockefeller Foundation, which led to the creation of data.org, our data collaborative. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Great, thanks so much for those introductions. And as you can see, we really have a splendid panel to go deep with regard to the third wave of data. And let me start with Jean-Noé. Jean-Noé, you already mentioned that a lot of your work is focused at the local level, at the city level, smart city concepts. So what's your assessment with regard to the current state of open data at the subnational level, and to what extent is it in harmony or in tension with what is happening at the national level, specifically, for instance, in Canada, but you also work globally?
Yeah, and thank you. It's a great question, and I think it kind of falls back onto some core principles that the open data community has been advocating for quite some time, right? When we talk about interoperability or data quality of different types of criteria, and what the COVID crisis has really raised is a range of concerns about the quality and availability of data. And in fact, you could argue that the health crisis actually exposed a significant and persistent set of data challenges, including at the subnational level. One of the things that governments have, I wouldn't say neglected, whether it's at the local level or national level, but because of their primary focus on the health crisis, what we haven't really seen is really kind of concerted efforts to really kind of document and reach out to different types of user communities to understand their specific data needs. So when we did a national public consultation last week, where we wanted to understand, which data sets are of high value and which data sets could be open that aren't currently. And lo and behold, a lot of local data sets came up. We had approximately 100 different participants who were actively engaged. And key themes that came out would be like, more data needs to be accessible. Surprise, surprise. Institutional barriers to data use. Surprise, surprise. Data access can be confusing. Surprise, surprise. So these are things that we're familiar with as data and open data advocates. But when you kind of scratch underneath the surface and you talk to municipalities, you also look at data assets that aren't necessarily released that could be. And you talk about testing centers and geospatial data, for example. There still isn't kind of that kind of massive coordination where you could have a standardized approach to these types of data sets. Demographic information, maybe new data sets at a different type of socioeconomic or demographic information around race and ethnicity or disability status, or even new data that we need to collect to face the current challenge at the local level, like people's anxiety. How do we start kind of measuring that? The evolving public transit system. In Canada, in Montreal in particular, where I'm based, we've kind of redesigned our roads. They're like, all of a sudden, there are an uptake of bicycling like across the city. So we need to document that. We need to kind of facilitate these services that are now being introduced in this context. Housing data, I could talk about that, and homelessness data, those repercussions, as well as employment and the impact on tourism and whatnot. So I think these are all types of data that we're seeing that there's quite a lot of need, and maybe at the local level, one thing that we've seen as well, and this is I think part of the beauty of being an open data advocate, is that you get to work and engage with a wide range of different types of communities to bring that data lens to the types of problems that they're facing. And we're seeing municipalities looking again at like 211 data standards, for example, and maybe bringing more interoperability across the board in partnership with the private sector and the philanthropic sector as well. So I'll stop there, but there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot more that could be released in high quality.
Great, thanks, Xiaonwei, and I will come back to some of the issues you raised, especially as it relates to actually engaging citizens and communities in defining the needs for open data as well, which we believe is something that initially wasn't on the horizon, but actually has become more and more, hopefully, more and more of a consideration moving forward with open data. But let's go to Arturo. And Arturo, you already mentioned that at MasterCard, of course, you have a basically a leadership. MasterCard has taken a leadership role in this whole area of data science for public good, leveraging both some of the data that MasterCard itself have, but also, of course, leveraging and inspiring others to do similar kind of initiatives. And tell us a little bit about what's the current state at MasterCard. How have you structured yourself in order to actually really provide insights that can inform public interest decisions? But also, what's the current state of play with regard to the release or reuse, which obviously is somewhat different sometimes, of data that the private sector collects?
Yeah, very happy to do so. And I would agree with John Noe that that this crisis, the COVID crisis, has kind of put data on the front lines. It's our first line of defense before a treatment and before a vaccine. All we can rely on at the moment is data. And for MasterCard, it's also been a moment to accelerate many of our collaborations or partnerships to do whatever we can to support, governments and NGOs during this crisis. As you know very well, Stefan, we collaborated with the GovLab. MasterCard has committed itself to a core set of principles that can be found in our data responsibility imperative that kind of guide our ethical collection, management, and use of data. Most of these principles are centered around the idea of data integrity and putting control back in the hands of individuals. But the one that I want to point out for this conversation is the sixth principle, which I think is rare, where we say a company like MasterCard doesn't only have a responsibility to protect the data and use it securely, but to put it in the public interest to try to achieve social impact. And our work, the center's work in this space of data for good is not new. The data imperative is from 2019, but we have been trying different ways of deploying our data safely for the public interest. We've tried data fellowships with some of the leading kind of data scientists and experts that we've found. We're about to publish with Leora Clapper from the World Bank a really interesting study using our data to show the asymmetric impact of hurricanes on small businesses, for example. We've worked with Michelle Thompson, who's a professor in the University of New Orleans, using our insights, our spend insights, to show if the redevelopment of one of the poorest parts of New Orleans, talking about local data, the Claiborne corridor of New Orleans, if that has worked, and that's online and has been published. And we are also creating tools. Later on, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Inclusive Growth Score, which we launched last year. It's the first time where we actually go beyond kind of a research partnership or a data grant into creating a tool that becomes a public good. So we've tried everything. We're very humble about it. We know that this is a new space, but we do believe that if we follow these core principles, we'll land on the right side, and we'll be able to push to push the agenda forward.
Thanks, Arturo. And what's your sense of your anyway within the whole space of data? What's your sense of peer or organizations like yourself? are you still lonely? That's the question. Or have you found some new friends in other corporations that think similarly?
Yeah, our intention in not just having an internal document, as you know, and by the way, the OECD has been a great partner as well, and Joanne Stoney, our Chief Data Officer, has participated in many initiatives with them as well. Our intention in publishing it is obviously what I would personally refer to leading by example, right? I don't think we're lonely. I think MasterCard is one of the few companies that is connected to almost everyone, right? So we have lots of partners, we have lots of collaborations. I think that ultimately, as in democracy, like, you know, voters have the last word. In the market, you know, it's shareholders, consumers, and other stakeholders that have the last word. And we believe that there is a differential treatment for those companies that are trying to do both, you know, stay out of trouble in the sense of being really strict on data privacy and all these things, but also understand that the data revolution needs to have a social impact. It cannot just stay in the private sector, right? And so trying to build a field. I do want to say that I think sometimes, and Jean-Noé pointed to this a little bit, sometimes there's a missed opportunity in centering the conversation just on the data, because the private sector has so many other things to offer, you know, experience on data management, on data warehousing, tons. We have 500 data scientists that are willing to do projects pro bono. We have a lot of them deployed in the field right now doing, you know, data science for good. So you've got people, you've got talent, you've got technology, and data is one of the components. But we believe that increasing the ability of others, particularly in the social sector, to use their data more effectively is also a source of lots of social value.
Great, thanks so much, Arturo. Let's go to Barbara. And so Barbara, you've been part of this field for a while. As you said, the last, I guess, 10 years, you've been playing a leadership role in corralling members of the OECD to really focus on open data. But as I said, I mean, initially it was a lot about opening the data, but more and more we've also seen the a heightened attention to data governance and specifically data ethics. And so we'd like to get a sense from you, Barbara, on how that is playing out across OECD countries, but also even within the OECD, how is data ethics being positioned within the open data community?
Yes, thanks, Stefan. I think that all the issues around the ethical use of data have always been there, but I think what is different is that there's a level of awareness and recognition at the moment, which is much more spread and felt by the broader ecosystem of open data, which creates a sort of pressure towards the holders and the users of data, primarily institutions, public institutions, to admit that there are concerns with the ethical use of data and that there is a need to take concrete actions to foster a culture and to sustain a behavior which is aiming at ensuring an ethical use of data. So what we are seeing a lot is that with the justification or excuse that, as a matter of fact, so much the focus is around the reuse of data and therefore the engagement of the different set of actors. Governments, I think, have tried on one side to push for adoptions of standards and guidelines within the public sector to be adopted across institutions to make sure that a certain coherent behavior when it comes to the ethical use of data is ensured. The objective is to make sure that the use is trustworthy, that there's a balance between the gains that come out of, or the impact, the value that comes out of enabling the access and reuse of data, but also the need to protect privacy, for instance. So the guidance and principles are often, and standards are often aiming to ensure the capacity to balance between the opportunities and the risks. And I think there's a lot of effort from a capacity building perspective to make sure that there's an awareness of the potential misuse of data. Misuse that can be made also by civil servants, for instance, sometimes not even being aware of that. And I think complementary to these actions, which are part of what we would call, I know you would call it the data governance, I think there are more like higher level and political efforts that target the development of ethical frameworks. So we've seen some governments having led this effort, the UK, Canada, for instance. The Anglo-Saxon countries, I have to say, have had a stronger culture, probably because their civil society scene is much stronger and has been advocating for such a framework for quite some time. But these ethical frameworks, I think, are important moments of responsibility taken up by governments, and it's a way also to empower the different parts of the administration to secure an ethical use of data. And it embeds principles that the two previous panelists have been talking about, which at the end of the day have to see with ensuring or securing a transparent use of data, the use of data made with integrity, accountability, with a clear, defined purpose, giving the possibility for especially citizens to control kind of data, what kind of use of data is being made. And I think it's extremely important that they try to show that the opening up of data and the use of data is serving a public purpose. Because I think there's a difference between the private sector and the public sector when it comes to the type of data that in many cases are being opened up. So the ethical behavior that we all expect from governments, it's always an extreme higher level. And so I think, yes, that the culture is growing. Within the OECD, we are trying to support governments in adopting common frameworks, building on the good experience of countries that have been a bit more advanced in this sense. We are pushing for making sure that governments understand that the index that we have on open data as a pillar, which focuses on reuse, and that's the area where in the past 5 years, during which we've been publishing the index, the governments have been lagging behind, all of them. So they've grown much stronger in increasing data accessibility and availability. But when it comes to reuse, which means demand side and some of the issues we'll be touching later, they're not there yet. But as a complement, we are also working on a draft recommendation, which is called an enhanced access and sharing of data, because I think that ethical use have to see a lot also with making sure that access to data is equitable. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that access is not always provided with the same opportunity to all layers of the open data scene.
Great. So thanks for that, Barbara. And let's go a step deeper on what you already mentioned as well, which is this. It's great to have access, but is there also an effort to really match the access with the purpose? And is there an effort, if you have a purpose, to then ultimately go back and then unlock certain kind of data sets? So this whole concept of publish with purpose clearly has gained a lot of traction, which is great, because anyway, for years we've been advocating for having a demand-driven open data approach. Are there some interesting, from your perspective, some interesting practices that should be adopted more broadly in order to really identify the purpose? Like Jean-Noé already, anyway, last week, as Jean-Noé said, they had an effort to actually go and identify certain kinds of demands. But you, from, anyway, the position where you sit, where you have all this comparative wisdom, are there some areas that you've seen that you would advocate for broader use?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that because the maturity of open data policies is advancing among many countries, I think we can expect from governments to include such principles, which then translate into actions in their open data strategies or policies. Meaning, I think that's something that needs to be expected. To go a step further, the open by default idea, which in many cases led to implementation, but the implementation was about let's dump data sets on a website, not caring about the demand in the ecosystem. So I think policies can be a very powerful tool to make sure that the focus is on the purpose. Second, I think many countries are also mature to refocus some of the ongoing initiatives. For instance, hackathon events. I think there are very good examples, recently one from Slovenia, where hackathon events have been organized in relation with a specific policy purpose. There was a specific issue that the government wanted to try solving, and so not wasting the opportunity of a good hackathon event or meetup, for instance, meaning the concrete initiatives that engage the ecosystem to have a specific purpose. I think it's a great opportunity. Another good example comes from Sweden, for instance, where the very same initiative, the hackathon called Hack for Sweden, it's on a yearly basis run by a different public sector institution, meaning they have 12 months to identify the specific policy goals or needs that they have, and they are trying to push for a release which is driven by a specific purpose. I think, however, that there's a third area which needs to target civil servants, meaning when we talk about open government data, we too often forget that as prosumers, civil servants should be the front runners. And still, I think there's a need to build capacities, create awareness, and also provide incentives for the civil servants to actually push for the understanding of what's the purpose and therefore drive in opening up, which is driven by the purpose. And here I would like to mention the example of that the Mexican government launched at the beginning of the open data wave a few years ago, which was an initiative that was actually bringing around the table public sector institutions that had no idea about open data, that were asked to put on the table a specific need they had, data that they could open up, and identify private sector actors that could actually, utilizing those data, come up with solutions that would have helped that specific institution. So it was not called Publish with Purpose back then, it was called Let's Bring the civil servants around the table, but I think it was really embedding the idea of having a specific purpose, but let's make sure that also the purpose can be identified, not only by the users outside of the public sector, but also within the public sector as well.
Great, thanks. And let's go to Arturo and stay a little bit with that question of, because obviously in the open data space, corporations not only have data that they can leverage in one way or another, and we're going to go back to what are some of the tools, but also the institutions that might be needed to leverage those more. But the private sector is also a demand side for open data. And quite often, as Barbara was indicating, there are clear constituencies that have a demand. But from your point of view, Arturo, is there? How would you go about having the private sector be more prolific with regard to sharing with public data holders what the possible needs might be with regard to data that could help the private sector, but also could help, for instance, the creation of data collaboratives where you commingle public and private data that actually might generate new insight. And any reactions from your end, Arturo?
Yeah, and I might be skipping ahead, but I think that this concept of the data steward is key in doing so. I'm going to talk about an example more from a personal perspective that I really admire, which is Raj Chetty's Opportunity Insights at Harvard. If you think about it, Professor Chetty was given, I think, 18 years of IRS data, income and taxes, some of the most sensitive data that you can have. But because, he's a trusted steward and his research speaks for himself, and I think he's a certified genius because he's got good genius scholarships. So he can produce this amazing tool, right? Opportunity Insights that then we can all use to understand not just what he cares about, social mobility and racial equity, but many other things. And it's online and it's free, and that's a great example. Now, I don't know if you know this, but in the second iteration, in the post-COVID iteration, Professor Chetty didn't just reach out to the government, but he started gathering data sets from different private sector organizations. The center has a great relationship with Opportunity Insights. And so we have been seeing how this has happened, acknowledging the data, but not, transforming it in a way where everyone is safe and and producing a very real-time evaluation and analysis of the economic impact of COVID in the United States at the county level or at the most granular level. So I think that is an example where you have an independent organization. I mean, it's Harvard University. You know that it's a good steward. You have a person who has a purpose, right? We know what questions Rashid is trying to answer. It's not an open-ended check, like, and it might have a set time frame, and when the hopefully economic crisis is over, maybe we won't need this tool anymore. But where I believe many private sector participants were very happy to support the effort, and the philanthropic sector were very happy to fund it. So to me, that's a great example of how all of this can come together, which I would just point to as, for example, a little glimpse of the future.
Great, thanks. And so, Jean-Noé, meaning I think what Arturo already was pointing to was the need for some kind of new intermediaries and even new positions. As you know, at GovLab, we've been advocating for data stewards as well. And thanks, Arturo, for making reference to that. But also, new kinds of even Open Nord is kind of a new kind of actor in the space. And I see the evolution of Open Nord actually also as an evolution responding to opportunities. So what's your sense, Jean-Noé, with regard to the need for both new professions but also new institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes to the heart of trust and the need to be able to have kind of evolving functions of different types of actors in the open data space and indeed just in the data space itself. Intermediaries is something that we've been thinking about for quite some time, and almost out of necessity, right, to be able to kind of reposition ourselves vis-a-vis the types of relationships that we want to have with governments, and how we want to kind of adopt a model of leadership that aims to be resourceful and facilitating and collaborative, right? And so these like underpinning values are really at the heart of these kind of dynamic kind of data ecosystems, where the flow of data doesn't happen by accident, and you need to have different types of skill set to be able to broker these types of conversations and engagement kind of mechanisms. And I think what intermediaries have also done is kind of enable, still along the concept of trust, kind of opened up a space for topics that maybe in the first wave of the open data kind of movement weren't at the forefront. But I think Barbara, you mentioned that the issues that are coming up now are issues that aren't necessarily new, but they're kind of brought into a spotlight. And issues around like risk analysis, for example, is conversations that as an intermediary, I often have with open data leaders or champions within public administrations. And I really see kind of risk analysis around data release as a trust building measure, and something that could be proactively released to the public to explain, the reasons why data is not made available, or the reasons why they could be available, and why government is making that decision. So kind of bringing more porosity, kind of more kind of openness within the decision-making process around data access, I think is something that intermediaries can do. The other thing here is sharing and that intermediaries can do is helping governments kind of share the burden of the complexity of data governance and data management. And I put emphasis on the distinction between governance and management. And that's something that we're doing currently, and that we're going to continue doing in the context of the City of Montreal, where we have a synchronization role between different hubs of stakeholders that are focused on different thematic themes on data. And we have to develop our own approach to learning as we kind of raise awareness, help stakeholders develop new skills, acquire new knowledge and new capacities to be able to participate actively and with influence and agency within the conversation around data governance. And lastly, I would just say, to hit a point that Barbara also made around the charters and the principles that, for the open data community, we cannot lose sight of the principles that really kind of bring us together. It also creates opportunities for intermediaries to hold governments to account of the principles that they're adopting, past the adoption of an open data policy, but looking at monitoring and certifying that data charters and digital rights charters are being not only adopted, but actually implemented, and trace and understand the impact that those principles that have been adopted through these charter mechanisms actually have locally. So intermediaries are very, very important. It's a space that I also see an opportunity to scale and to have more intermediaries participate. I think it's a space that could benefit from a greater diversity, but it does require quite a significant shift in approach for an organization to adopt that role. And I think there's an opportunity there, more broadly speaking, for the data communities around the world.
Great, excellent. Thanks for that. So I'm sensitive to the timing. I could go on for the rest of the day because I've like 1,000 questions. But let's go to, I think, the last question here, and perhaps start with Arturo, and then end with Barbara, to give Barbara the last word of the day here. And so Arturo, meaning you've developed this tool to inform the opportunity zones discussion within the US. It would be interesting to learn a little bit about it, but then more importantly, what is like the one element that you would advocate? If we would be able to fix that, then we would be able to do more of what you've been doing in terms of actually informing, for instance, cities in what is their current state of play with regard to certain kinds of inclusive growth objectives. So Arturo.
Yeah, very happy. So let me start with the why, right? With the purpose. So the Center for Inclusive Growth cares obviously about income inequality, wealth inequality. We also were one of the first to start talking about information inequality, which is why everything we do has a data-driven component. And in our economic development work, which we decided would be about places, because part of what has been left behind in the last decades of economic growth has been places that have not benefited from that growth. And if you look at the United States, you can find those places within cities or in rural areas. And so we were in that space. And I think just very quickly, the Inclusive Growth Score is an example of how a company learns with its stakeholders. And as Jean-Noé was saying, and how you build trust and you go step by step, right? So none of these things will just happen automatically. We had a tool, a commercially available tool that measured insights around spending in a constrained geographical area. You could go down even beyond the census tract level, right? That was a commercial tool. Our clients buy it to understand where to open a coffee shop and stuff like that. The center started working with Accelerator for America, a group of cities that were trying to prepare cities for this investment, the opportunity zones. And it just happened that I saw the commercial tool when I was meeting the people from Accelerator for America. And it just clicked in my head. We need to deploy this type of data into understanding what investments these cities need in their kind of to redevelop their downtown core, etc. And so it was a very long process. It took a whole year of understanding what their needs were, which of our data elements were relevant for them, what other public data would paint a bigger story, so that we were not just putting out spending insights and that's it. So we needed to contextualize it in what we created, the model of inclusion and prosperity. Long story short, we published the data and created a map of opportunity zones, which cover around 1% of the U.S. territory and 10% of the population. But last month, we decided to open the data for the whole country. So if you go into the Inclusive Growth Score now, you see all of the 70,000 plus census tracts of the US. So it went from a very specific purpose, a very specific use case, to us understanding that the city, the mayors and the economic development officials wanted to see the other neighborhoods too. They wanted to understand what was happening in other parts of the city, and convincing that the internal conversation is a key here, right? You convince the data stewards inside of the company that it's okay to release this data, that it's okay to have this conversation, that people are reacting positively. And we were very lucky to, we were, the Inclusive Growth Score was a finalist in the Fast Company World Changing Ideas in 2 categories. We were highlighted by the White House on economic development. So very quickly, you kind of go from an idea, if the company is open to it, to now having a map that shows all of the census tracts of the US with our data and other publicly available data, which we consider to be a public good. And it's a process of learning, trust, taking people through the journey. I think that is the key.
And was there one barrier that's that you felt, or one pain point that you says, well, if we could take that pain point away, we would be able to do more of those?
Yeah, I think the main barrier is this translation between, not just between inside and outside the company, the people outside understanding the constraints that we have inside. For example, people say, why are you publishing yearly data? And why do we need to wait kind of 6 months to see the data if you have it like today, or a week lag? And there are some very, very like clear investor relation concerns, right? Because we are a publicly traded company, we can't release our data, otherwise, people would speculate on it. And that sometimes the other side doesn't understand, right? There are some, data cleaning processes that need to happen. And also, you need to do things that don't compete with your commercial products, right? So, and then getting the inside world to understand, how important this data is when put in the hands of a professional that's looking at redeveloping this area. So it's really this translation, this bridge that you build that solves, I think, the biggest barrier, which is communication, I guess.
Great, that's very insightful. Jean-Noé, one pain point from your end, or barrier, that if we could deal with that one, we would, the third wave would be up and running?
Well, I think one of the barriers is not to get caught up in the hype of kind of new trends that come along when we still haven't sorted out and addressed some core issues around data literacy before getting ahead of ourselves. And or let's put it this way, there are probably a group of stakeholders that can kind of juggle and chew at the same time and do kind of 2 complex things at once. But when we talk about data literacy, I think from an inclusive perspective and growing and scaling out and much more widely the open data kind of community or data community itself, that's certainly an obstacle before getting caught up in kind of algorithmic data governance literacy, for example, which is a whole other set of issues. So the complexity of the types of skill set that are required, we need to kind of diversify our offering and also create new linkages and alliances in order to be able to do that. And relationships with the private sector and the not-for-profit sector are critical now more than ever. And I think I'm seeing a lot of opportunities in that regard. But these are, from a values perspective, I think we need to be able to kind of recognize that we can have strong openness values and work with the private sector. And those are not, incompatible kind of allies with common causes.
Excellent. Barbara, you have the last word for this panel. So what, Barbara, you're disappearing. What are the, I thought you were heading off as a result of me putting pressure on you. But what are the, from your point of view, what would be like 1 or 2 kind of areas where if we would prioritize that, we would be able to actually be more transformative, realizing, as Jean said, is that we still have a lot more work to do in the initial idea of open data as well.
Yeah. Listen, to me, there are two words that encapsulate many of the actions that I think need to be prioritized, which is the data governance. And there's one reason, because I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that with this complexity as a crisis, it has just put governments through a 360-degree experience that normally they live through individual crises. But there's going to be another situation that will put governments in front of a challenge. And what we've seen is that many governments paid for the fact that their open data policies had not been sustained in the long run. So sustainability of open data policies, which means that if we have elections, there's a new government, that new government doesn't have the option to discontinue all the activities and initiatives around open data because that doesn't have a political color, requires the establishment of a data governance that, as a result, I will not discuss hours on what we consider being data governance at the OECD, but as a result would enable what Jean-Noël was defining as a key action, which I agree with, which is the collaboration with different actors, the academia with governments, the private sector with governments and with the academia. Those are new forms of partnerships and collaborations around data that need to grow, that need to be able to count on the sustainability of open data policies. They need to have, on the other side, a public sector which is a learning organization, meaning that does not only have specific profiles around data, but also that has people who are aware on the fact that they are sitting on data that, if released, can help create these new forms of partnerships and value creation. So that's why I insist so much on the data governance, because oftentimes we think that it's a very theoretical piece, whereas the initiative that we have with the NYU around, trying to come up with support, technical support instruments that can help give technical support to governments, to authorities, so that they can better understand how you match a data with a specific question, with a specific action, and in a specific phases of whatever crisis. I think that's the way to go. But once those governments have those instruments, in many cases, they need to have the conditions at home in terms of data infrastructure, data architecture, leadership, capacities, the adequate legal and regulatory framework that would enable them to say, okay, I have this great framework that I can apply, but then I need to have the way ahead without obstacles in front of me. So I know it's a big answer, but I think, if we don't get that overarching piece in the right place, we will keep also having parallel policies on AI, on data ethics, on open data, and that breaks my heart because it's a missed opportunity. Like for many cases, it has been, the whole discussion around public sector innovation and digital government and open data that they were and open government that they were seen as isolated pieces, which instead are the same elements of a single puzzle.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to all the panelists. Thanks, Barbara, Jean-Noël, Arturo, for sharing your wisdom in this short 45 minutes that we've had. And I think a key message here indeed, thanks, Barbara, for emphasizing the need to be systematic, sustainable, and responsible, and that actually only by achieving those three objectives together, we will really make progress. And I hope that this series of the Summer of Open Data will give governments and the private sector and civil society some of the best advice moving forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.